into the day and talk to some folks around you. So if you can find someone to answer one of the questions, then move on to someone else, answer a second question, and so on. And then we'll wait a little bit longer before we get started. Just a couple minutes.
We are going to actually get started. I'm going to ask you to just maybe pause for a minute. I know everybody's doing the exciting bingo game, and we're going to let you continue with that. But we do want to be respectful of your time, and thank you so much for being here, for coming through with the weather and all of that. My name is Julianne Mitchell, and I am part of the field team. And I just want to very quickly just to recognize if members of the field team are in the audience, Jessica and Kathy and Denise, and Lizzie and Near and Molly, they all help put this on, and it's a wonderful opportunity. So anyway, just to dive right in, first of all, we are trying to increase our access to training. So you'll notice the camera over here. This is really just for the presenters. We do have a live stream audience. However, if you prefer not to be on camera, it's not really going to be moving around. It is going to be static, but just let us know. It really is just for the presenters and for our live stream audience. We also have started doing a new sign-in process that we're really excited about. That's going to increase access and efficiency as far as being able to get you your certificates of completion and evaluations and things along those lines. So if you did not sign in electronically on the iPads, if you could please be sure to do that before you leave today, that would be great as well. Also for parking, everybody should have gotten a parking pass. If you did not go through the arm that kind of rises like this and parked on the lower level, then you will get a ticket. That first level is paid parking. You have to use your pass to go up a level, and then you can park anywhere on those floors. But if for some reason that was not the case for you, please let us know because they will give you a ticket, and we don't want that to happen to anybody. And then finally, we have snacks and beverages. Bathrooms are to the back as well. And I think that's all the logistics for now. And now we can get to more of the exciting part. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Heather Arnold-Renicker is a clinical assistant professor, and she's our lead faculty for the Organizational Leadership and Policy Practice concentration and teaches across this concentration. Prior to joining GSSW, she spent 4 years in Washington, D.C., teaching, organizing, and working in political leadership development, creating leadership pathways for those left out of political leadership. And her research interests include the intersectionality between white dominant culture, white fragility, and social justice nonprofit organizations. Brian Gonzalez is a clinical assistant professor here, as well as the assistant dean for academic affairs. He's a licensed clinical social worker and licensed addiction counselor who uses social justice as a guide in his role of educator, trainer, and consultant. He is dedicated to the growth and development of helping professionals, inclusive learning, community partnerships, and best practices for client and worker success. Prior to GSSW, he served in his community in various capacities, including family therapist, clinical supervisor, and executive director of a nonprofit that provided mental health and substance use treatment for clients in community corrections, county jails, and outpatient settings. And I am very honored to call them colleagues and friends. And so with no further ado, we have Heather and Brian.
All right, so we have about 5 more minutes for you all to do the bingo, just because it gives you an opportunity to kind of check in with folks that are here and have a little bit of settle-in time. So go ahead and continue your conversations or find somebody. For folks who are just coming in, there's bingo sheets on the table that just have some questions about how you're sort of entering the space today. What are you feeling like today? Is there anything in particular you want to take out of this opportunity or experience? And any fears or hopes or intentions or questions you have. So you can find somebody that maybe you haven't spoken with before, just to kind of check in and see if you have anything you want to share. And so we'll start talking about that. Tell it now. Say it to everyone. For folks online. So I'm just going to check in with the online folks, so the folks in the room can ignore me for a second. So for folks online, if you can see the PowerPoint, there are questions for the community bingo and for you all. If you're with other folks, try to talk to them about the questions that are up on the screen. And if you're not with someone, if you're watching this on your own, then feel free to just write your answers to the questions silently. conversation. What do you think? Is there anything that came up that you want to share with the larger group? I heard you talking, I know you had a conversation. Did anybody say, I would love to hear a little bit about like your hopes for today, intentions, or maybe questions that you're sitting with right now before we get started? For the online folks, you have to use a mic. Sorry.
So I feel a little embarrassed to share this, but I'm just going to share it. So when I graduated from social work school, I don't know if it was just the timing, it was 11 years ago, or maybe it was just the school I went to, but we didn't have a course on power, privilege, and oppression. And so what I'm hoping to get out of this today is I feel like I understand some of what I should know as a social worker, but I also feel like I don't know everything I should know, and I don't have all of the language that I should. Like, just the YouTube video gave me a new term, intersectionality. So I just want to better understand what I need to know as a social worker, and better understand what my intern is learning so that we can be speaking the same language.
Great, thank you so much. Other folks, anything that came up in your conversations that you want to share? Questions, intentions, yeah.
So for me, I didn't feel comfortable disclosing this until I'm now holding a microphone. For me, one of the fears that I had for today is that when we are being the supervisor for our interns, it's something that comes that we are supposed to be knowledgeable and experienced and being able to present that to our interns. And it's a fear for me that they're not going to see that for me, and I want to be able to continue to develop my skills and to develop their skills as well through that. So I was which led into my hope for today, is for me to be able to have more tools in my toolbox to have our interns be able to actualize their potential.
Great, thank you. One more. Is there one more that folks have that they want to share?
Thanks. I was just sharing that we have a few interns from a few different schools down at our agency, and I feel like we have one intern that is spearheading this conversation of intersectionality and I think just diversity in general in our staff community, and how to make sure that we help those who aren't the blinding majority of who make up our clientele. And so I hope to leave here with the ability to join her in that spearhead effort. Therefore, she's not essentially the only one talking about it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Really quickly, too, if there's any questions from people online, we'll have someone who can let us know if you have them.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So these will conflict with each other, so we keep shifting back and forth. So one of the things that I just wanted to say is that all of you are coming with sort of your own expectations, your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own challenges, and we have 2 hours, which is not enough time. And so we're going to do our best to give you some ideas and strategies and tools for how to use a specific way of thinking to help you manage and navigate situations where you might feel a little bit unsure about what to do, as a way to offer you some initial ideas for how to kind of step into the conversation and start to engage, and then some tools and resources after you leave for additional information, just so that you're aware that we recognize that in 2 hours we can't address all of the things that you might be hoping for, but that we're going to do our best to give you the tools to kind of navigate some of that. So we're going to do just a quick introduction to add a little bit about who we are and why we're sort of here for this particular reason, in addition to what Julianne shared earlier. So I specialize in doing anti-oppression consulting work with organizations to look at organizational practices and policies around issues of, it varies in language, so cultural responsiveness, anti-oppression, anti-racism, Depending on the organization, people use sort of different language. So I work with lots of organizations around how they can think about their policies, practices, job descriptions, supervision, evaluations, and how those evaluations and practices reflect particular ideas of how work looks and what success looks like in an organization, and then how those things impact management. And so just to give you some context as to like why I'm up here. And then I manage 2 students currently and have management experience in my background prior to coming to GSW as a faculty member. And so we're going to talk a little more about our experiences as we share some of the tools that we are going to be talking to you about with you today. And so you'll hear a little bit more about it as we go forward.
And for me, so similarly, I just want to comment, see, I really appreciate someone saying like, oh, we didn't have a diversity class in our program, and I actually see a lot of alums in the audience who can probably attest that the diversity class as it stands now is very different than probably what you went through. So Heather and I both teach the PPO course, and we've done some intentionality on trying to bring in the content that matches how students are actually going through that sequence. We will be focusing on race today, and we're also going to look at the differences in terms of how students of color might experience the class versus those that come from dominant identities in that PPO sequence. So we will try to integrate that into our conversations, because I think you're not alone. Even if you did have a cultural diversity class, it is structured in a way that's complicated. I think a lot of people would see it, and sometimes our students even struggle of what does this mean in terms of how do I apply it? How do I have conversations with my supervisor around this content? So I just wanted to comment on that. So we both teach power, privilege, and oppression. I similarly do consultation for criminal justice entities around this content. There's a huge paradigm shift that's happening in terms of trauma-informed care being more culturally responsive, but still in an involuntary basis. So it's a tension point that is really complicated in the sense of also thinking about who are the people that are actually in incarceration. So that's one area. The references that I teach across the curriculum, specifically clinical classes. So I'm the lead for the intersections mental health, substance use, and trauma class, which is the class that all mental health students have to take here. It's based in critical thinking, so they sometimes will struggle with this. I will reference that class quite a bit, as well as I also now teach the suicide assessment and interventions course, which is a new requirement for our mental health students. I will reference that class as well because of the critical thinking in this content. And then I'm also just going to share that I'm also on the DORA board for pharmacy for Colorado. So I will reference a lot of my experiences there in terms of being an advocate for culturally responsive, consequential actions when it comes to thinking about how our licenses are managed and handled, which I'm sure a lot of us in the room are probably a part of that system in some capacity. And I'll talk about how identities are discussed and not discussed in terms of this work. So.
Yeah, that's fine. So one of the things that we wanted to do today is just give you a little bit of goals and outcomes and a little bit of context building, which I'll do a little bit of, and then Brian will add. So we're going to just offer some perspectives on allyship or culturally responsive supervision and give you some tools for breaking down mental models and using critical thinking and supervision. And those 2 things are in a handout on your table or that folks have been sent online, and we'll go through that with you as we move forward today. We want to just identify that conversations are actually a tool, and that it's a skill to learn how to have these conversations in a supervisory context and do it well. And so when we just, I think sometimes people come to trainings like this and expect that we're going to give you like a checklist, here are all the things that you can do, and then you're going to be perfectly fine. And in reality, it's actually how we engage in conversations and how we interact with people and how we respond when something may not go well or we're not sure what to do that matters more than doing the right thing 100% of the time. And so there's no checklist for what to do or not to do that will give you 100% of the right answers 100% of the time. So we're going to try to give you actually more of the skill set or the tools or the questions to ask so that you can navigate different situations with that practice, because so many of conversations around identity and issues of power, privilege, and oppression are very nuanced, and they're also very context specific. So not any one person with any one culture has the exact same experience as everyone else. And so sometimes we, in the past, have sort of approached it as like, if you're going to work with someone from X community, here's like 25 things you should know. Now, there are generalizable, understandable cultural components of how people move through the world, but those when you rely on those, often you make the mistake of generalizing something to an entire group of people where there's just a lot of nuance and complexity in how we show up in the world and our identities. So if you came here expecting a checklist, I apologize that we're disappointing you and not giving you one. But I promise that the tools that we use are ones that we use and that we give our students and that I have seen organizations work with have been really effective in their practices. Anything else you would add?
I would say that we've also been having discussions around just what the word allyship means. So I will say that one of the areas that I really try to stress and emphasize, especially when I'm working with people from a supervisory lens, is that I think a lot of times we can graduate from our social work program and automatically think that we automatically are an ally, or that we already have innate ability without having to kind of think about how does this continue on in the way in which we work with not only our students if we're supervising students, but also just in general in terms of the agencies and the clients' work that we do. We've also been having discussions about how allyship has a different type of connotation based on the people that are actually involving the word. So when we think about, I think I'm just going to say this is one of the things we've been kind of looking at is when we have two people of a dominant culture that go together to help each other, we automatically might call it consultation. But when we have a person from the dominant culture who's quote unquote helping a person from a marginalized community, it's called allyship. So just kind of thinking about how some of those nuances are actually ingrained in how we just use language, and that we want us to really think openly about what does this word mean when we're working with people and how our identities actually impact that.
So we also just wanted to give you an idea of what students are learning in the classroom. So for folks who didn't graduate from this specific program or who haven't graduated in the last probably 5-ish years, the curriculum around power, privilege, and oppression has changed quite a bit. So when I was a student here 11 years ago, the content was called, the class was called multiculturalism, and it was essentially like a checklist. It was like a week-by-week identity-based, like, oh, here's how you work with African Americans, here's how you work with, Asian Americans, and we came, the school itself came to realize that that is not an effective way. Based on research, we know that actually the better way for you to become more culturally responsive is to know who you are. What is your identity? How does your identity connect to the ways that systems work in our culture? What is the dominant narratives that we hear? And how do we sort of understand that systemic context as we're moving through the world in our practice as social workers? And so it's moved a lot away from like focusing on here's what you do with X community and more who am I in the world and how does that interact with people in a variety of different ways. And so some of the students who come out of this program, I think, are having this pretty intense experience around systemic analysis, looking at issues of oppression broadly, and I think are kind of walking into spaces of professional practice, expecting that other people have had a similar orientation to the world, and it doesn't always happen that way, right? Because as a culture broadly, the United States doesn't really talk about that. And so they're kind of still learning how do we navigate spaces where we're dealing with folks with different experiences and expectations and knowledge about this issue, and I think we've just seen some of those complexities come through. The last thing I'll say is this idea of intersectionality that you brought up, which I think was really helpful in terms of knowing that not everybody knows what that means. And so we try to have conversations with our students about not just how identities are intersectional, so what is my identity as like a white woman who comes from a middle-class background who is queer identified? What does it mean for me to have an intersecting layers of identities? And not just that, but how do those identities interact with the intersections of systems and how systems play into and benefit or marginalize me at different levels and different capacities based on those identities. And so we also sort of flip it where students are trying to think about if we're coming up with solutions in the world, how do we come up with solutions that address things at their intersections? So we're not just saying like, oh, we're gonna talk about immigration, we're gonna talk about immigration and class and gender and sexuality and gender expression and how all those things intersect and how do we address the problem sort of in a multitude of ways. And so that's just a little bit of context about how our students are kind of stepping into the space of being in the internship experience. And then we're going to talk a little bit about OR's steps to critical thinking, which is something that we use in the PPO classroom, as well as in other classes, about how students can start to use this practice of challenging assumptions and questioning what they might think about particular people or groups or issues in order to kind of break some of those things down.
So one of the ways that I use OR is critical steps to critical thinking. So I appreciate the comment of maybe I wasn't going to share this, but now the microphone's in my hand. You probably came in here today, whether you shared it or not, with probably one thing that you think you're really good at in terms of your supervisory style, your supervisory approach. I want you to keep that in context, but I also then want you to think about what's an area, whether it's shared or it's actually visible to other people or to yourself, that you really do find yourself perhaps struggling with. And I want you to really focus on both in this context of this critical thinking approach. So I want you to challenge what you actually think you're really good at in the discussions that we're having today, while also at the same time thinking about areas of improvement or growth that you want to really focus on, given that this is what we're having as a platform. So I also want us to kind of keep that in context, because sometimes our blind spots are the areas that we think we're already doing a good job in, and that's actually where we want you to kind of step into that today in terms of thinking about how this information relates to those areas.
So OR steps to critical thinking are really about how do we sort of break down the assumptions that we might be making about any given situation or person or group of people. And so really, as you can see on the slide, and they're also in the handout that we sent out and also on the tables, it starts with identifying and challenging assumptions. There's sort of a prerequisite to that, right? Like you have to know what your assumptions are to identify and challenge them, and that sometimes is tricky because often the assumptions we're making are sort of tacit. They're sort of underneath our awareness, and so our ability to actually find them and identify what is the assumption I'm making here can be hard. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that using an idea called mental models, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we start by identifying and challenging our assumptions, being aware of our current context. So what's happening in the organization, in the world, how does that influence the ways in which you're interacting with someone in a supervisory space? How do you search for exceptions to that assumption? So is there something else going on? Is there some other idea or concept or information that can kind of help you challenge that particular assumption? And then develop a reflective analysis. So how do you be thoughtful and reflective on what it is that you're learning or think that you know about any given situation? And so it's essential that you kind of revisit these steps and continue to use them to examine information that you're learning through organizations, through the media, perhaps in context of your own personal life. So an example of this might be if you're somebody who grew up with very strict definitions of binary gender, and you just believe there are men and there are women and there's nothing in between, then you would go through this process of saying, okay, wait a minute, I'm making an assumption here. There's other information out in the world that's telling me that this assumption might not be accurate for everyone. And so how can I think about that context, look for some exceptions of stories that I know of people who don't fall into that particular category of binary gender, and then how do I be reflective on that to try to be thoughtful about how that particular assumption is influencing how I'm interacting with folks, either in your client population or with the folks that you're supervising. So we'll keep going in terms of how to apply this, but we wanted to introduce it here because we wanted to make sure you heard it before we asked you to apply it. Are there any questions about this just generally before we move to the next piece? Okay. All right. You'll have opportunities to ask again if you have questions that pop up. Let me do this one. Okay. So one of the tools that we use in one of our classes on leadership and change is to think about mental models. This is somewhat similar to implicit bias, sort of, in the sense that it's essentially saying that we have these particular ideas of what something is that informs how we behave. So we have mental models of everything. We have mental models of what we think interns should do, right? If you give interns copying and that's all you give them, you have a mental model of what interns are capable of or what interns are supposed to be doing in their work. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. We can talk about that later in terms of like whether or not you believe that's the effective job for interns to be doing. But mental models are these images or assumptions and stories we carry in our minds. And it's not just about other people, it's about ourselves, it's about how institutions function and every aspect of the world. So these are maps that actually live in our long-term memory. and become short-term perceptions by which we live our day-to-day lives, and it informs how we behave in the world. And we have it, again, for everything. So every interaction we have and the ways in which we respond are really informed by those mental models, what we think the world should look like and should be. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about what your mental model of supervision is. So think about what are the assumptions and stories that you have or that you tell yourself about what a supervisor does or is. What is the role of a supervisor? What is the responsibility of a supervisor? What does that look like for you? And so on the slide, there are questions. So for folks online, if you want to do this in pairs, if you're with other people, or just do some silent writing about the questions about what is your mental model of supervision. So what does it mean to be a supervisor? What's your initial instinct in response to a concern, issue, or idea brought to you by us in supervision? How does this identity wheel that you did prior to coming today come into this? How does your own identity inform how you think about supervision? And how does it impact your model of supervision? Do all those questions make sense to folks? Any clarification needed? Okay, so in pairs, if you can just start to talk about what do you think your mental model of supervision is, and then we'll come back together.